Hey, today I'm going to be doing a build tutorial on the Reptile X4R 5-inch. Let's see what's inside the box. So in the box, you get a top plate, bottom plate, 4 arms, camera mounting plates, a support plate for the top plate, I'm guessing, and a stacking plate for the flight controller. You also get the required standoffs for the frame, a fiberglass insulator for the power distribution board, some mounting screws, some more nuts and bolts for the body, some standoffs for the flight controller, power distribution board, XT60 connector, and a 5-volt step-down regulator. And you also get an assembly schematic. So this frame, with this frame, I'm going to be using the Emax 2205 2300 kV motors. These are the red bottoms. I'm going to be using a SP Racing F3 flight controller, a Runcam Swift 600 TV line camera, an FX799T 200 milliwatt transmitter, video transmitter, X4R SBus Frsky receiver, a micro Minimosd, and some Dys 30A ESCs. Now that we got the frame out of its packaging and we soldered the 5-volt step-down regulator and the XT60 to the power distribution board, we can start assembling this frame. So what I like to do first is put 4 of these bolts through the bottom plate. Laying it flat on the table, and then line up the arms and put all 4 arms on. And then taking the fiberglass insulator for the power distribution board, putting that on, and then finally the power distribution board. Once that's on, you can just hold it into place with the standoffs for now, temporarily. And now we can insert the rest of the bolts. Flipping it over and putting on all the lock nuts. Now that you have it all hand tightened, you can get your hex driver and a wrench and tighten everything up. Make sure you tighten everything nice and firmly, but not too tight that you strip the bolts. Check if it's nice and tight, and it is. There's no wobble or anything, no play in the arms. So now I'm going to remove these standoffs because they're going to get in the way of soldering the ESCs to the pads, and I don't want to burn any standoffs. There you go. So now that we have the frame assembled and it's nice and tight, we can start gathering the ESCs and the motors and get this build starting. But before we do any building at all, what I like to do is to program these ESCs, flash them with the latest BL Heli or whatever BL Heli you're comfortable with. I'm going to put 14.4 on these babies, and then we'll come back. So now that we flashed the ESCs with BL Heli 14.4 and changed the motor direction for 2 of the ESCs, we can decide where we want to put the ESCs and then measure out the motor wires and cut them. So I think I'm going to have the ESCs right there. Get my motors, put them on, get my cutters, cut the motor wire, and cut all the motor wires. Now do that for all 4. So what I do is I just put one motor on top of the other, measure out the wire, and cut it. So now that you have all the wires on the motors cut to length, we're going to strip them and tin them. So repeat the process for the rest of the motors, and then we'll get on to the next step. So now that we have all motors stripped and tinned and ready to go, we need to prepare the ESCs. So what I like to do first is to remove the shielding from the ESC. Once the heat shrink is off the ESC, remove the heat sink. Get your silicone conformal coating and put a nice coat onto the ESC. This acts as some waterproofing just in case you end up crashing into a puddle or a pond or a lake or a river. It might save your ESC. So once that's done, let it dry, and we can get on to the next step. So now that the conformal coating has dried, I forgot to mention that you should remove the signal wires because we're not going to be using the length that comes with the ESCs by default. So let's remove these signal wires. And for this build, I'm not going to be using the ground wire, I'm just going to be using the signal wire. Thought I would mention that. So now that you have all the ESCs ready, let's put the heatsink back on here. Now we can tin the ESC to prepare it for the motors. So just get a nice blob on there. So once that's done, we can solder up our motors to our ESCs. Let me move this over this way so it's easier for me to solder. So I like to start with the middle wire. There we go. Our motor is wired to our ESC. So now we do it to the rest of them. So now that we have all our motors soldered up to our ESCs, now we can get back to the actual frame. So now what we need to do is tin all these pads on the power distribution board. So once you tin all the pads, the next thing to do is to mount the actual motors onto the frame so we can figure out where we need to cut the power leads for the ESCs. So the next step in our assembly is mounting the motors onto the frame so we can get an accurate measurement of where we need to cut these power cables for the ESCs. So what we're going to need to mount these motors is some M3 by 6 bolts, an Allen key, and some Loctite. So let's get this motor out of the way. So just put a dab of Loctite on here. Line up the motors. And screw them in. I'm only using 2 bolts for each motor. It'll reduce weight. And you really don't need all 4, I think. So make sure the shaft and the bearing of the motor is centered in the hole of the arm, like so. Tighten it up. Now do that for the other 3 sides, and then we'll get on to the next step. So now that you have the motors mounted, we can cut the power wires to the ESCs to length. So we're going to need a cutter for that. Move these out of the way temporarily. So let's do the first one. It's always better to cut a little bit extra, just in case. You don't want the wires to be too short. So this ground wire is going to go around there. Now that you have all the wires cut, we can strip them and tin them. And repeat the process for the rest of them, and then we'll get to the next step. So now that we have all the wires tinned, our next step is to get the signal wires soldered onto the ESCs. So what we need to do is unwind the signal wire. these wires from the connector. To make 2 signal wires. Do the same thing to this one. I'll straighten these wires out. They don't have to be perfectly straight. Or you don't even have to straighten them at all. So what we're going to do is cut these to length, solder the signal cable back onto the ESC. Let's get our flight controller. It's going to be mounted somewhere there. It's always best to leave a little bit of extra. So let's just say that this is going to go here. So I'm going to cut it about right there, giving it some slack. One down. Two. Three. So now we strip these, tin them, solder them to the ESCs. So now that we have all the signal wires connected, the next step is to cover the ESCs with heat shrink. Now that we got our heat shrink on, get our heat gun out. So now that the heat shrink is on, what we can do is put some double-sided tape on the bottom of each ESC and tape it to the frame. Press down firmly onto the ESC to get a nice adhesion onto the frame, so the ESC will not come off and crash. So once that's all done, now we can finally solder the ESCs onto the power distribution board. move the signal wires out of the way because they burn very easily. As you can see, I'm not pushing down on the wire at all because that will squish it and give you a bad solder. Just going to each side nicely and moving the soldering iron from side to side and over top, like so. This wire is a little bit too long. I'm going to have to trim that one. So I'm going to trim that wire, solder it on, and then we'll get to the next step. So now we get a battery, plug it in, and hopefully there's no smoke. And it's perfect. So now that we have the battery plugged in, what we want to check, get the voltmeter out and check to make sure the step down regulator is actually outputting 5 volts. .06. All right, we're good. Unplug the battery. So the next step is to mount the flight controller. So we're going to need some standoffs and some screws or bolts to do so. So flip this thing over, put the bolts through, flip it around, screw the standoffs into place. Firmly tighten the standoffs by hand, and then after we'll give it just a little turn with the hex driver. There we go. Now get the flight controller. So this flight controller has been already conformal coated. I have the beeper soldered directly onto the board, the VBAT wires soldered directly onto the board. connection points for the motors and for the power to power the flight controller. And as I said before, this is a SP Racing F3 flight controller by Clean Flight. So before we install the flight controller, we're going to need a 5-volt output wire, which I have right here. Turn the soldering iron back on. Make sure you have your polarity proper. Let's get the tweezers. Now we can plug everything into the board. So now what we're going to do is plug the ESCs and the 5-volt power into the flight controller, mount the flight controller. So before I do that, I'm going to get these little O-rings and put them on the top of the standoffs just to reduce some vibration on the flight controller. Alright, so motor 1 and motor 2 goes into here, motor 1 and motor 2. Motor 3 and motor 4 plug in like so. So this is motor 1, this is motor 2, this is motor 3, and this is motor 4. So now 5-volt power. Turn it around and push the flight controller onto the standoffs. Looks like it's a tight fit. Okay, there we go. Flight controller's installed. So what we want to do now is solder the VBAC cables to the power of the power distribution board, so we can get a reading on how much battery we have left. Careful, don't want to touch the signal wire. Should have just put pins on the flight controller or the power distribution board. And then I could have just plugged in. Ground. Okay, that's good. Next, we're going to plug into the SP Racing flight controller, flash the firmware, calibrate the motors, and see that everything is running properly. Let's just plug it in right now. Make sure the flight controller actually turns on. This is a used flight controller. Hopefully I have the polarity right. And it's good. So now that we got Betaflight installed on the flight controller and calibrated the motors, next thing we need to do is install the receiver. This is an Frsky X4R sbus. So we're just going to be mounting it right here in the back. So very simple. Put a piece of double-sided tape on the back of it. Put it in the desired location. Right there looks good. Push it down firmly. Plug it into the flight controller. It's also a good idea to put a dab of hot glue here so this never falls out. So once that's done, grab a zip tie. And there we go. The next step is to install the standoffs. So for this we're going to need our hex driver, some Loctite, and some screws. So in the front I'm going to use these longer screws because when you crash, most of your crashes it's a front end impact. So these longer screws will make the standoffs a lot stronger than they would with these smaller 4mm or 5mm screws. Now that you got all the standoffs hand tightened, get out the hex driver. And tighten them as much as you can. There we go. Now our next step is to install the FPV system. So we're going to be using a RunCam Swift camera, which in this camera bracket, it's designed specifically for this camera, as you can see. And I think we can get an angle of -20 to about maybe 60 degrees, maybe 65 even. We're also going to be using the FX799T 200 milliwatt video transmitter. And a micro Minimosd. So before I install the FPV system, I'm going to need to go into the settings for the camera, change a bunch of things. I'm going to need to program the Minimosd, or micro Minimosd. We're going to put MWOSD version 1.6 on here. And then we're going to wire it all up and get it running. Okay, so now that we got the firmware flashed onto this micro Minimosd, which we are using MWOSD 1.6, and we have the RunCam Swift configured for FPV use, the next step is to put on the stacking plate. First thing we need to do is get a zip tie. Put a zip tie through it. This is what's going to be holding down the video transmitter. The video transmitter is going to be sitting on top of this stacking plate. So we install the stacking plate. Mount it with the nuts that came in the kit. Screw it down. Get the transmitter. Make it nice and tight. So now that that's done, the power on the ground is going to be connected right here on the power distribution board. So we can cut these wires. I left a little bit extra just in case. So let's put this aside for now. Let's work on the micro Minimosd. So let's pre-tin all the pads that we were going to be using. this wire. We're also going to be installing this cap. This is so the micro Minimosd never loses power and you don't lose your display. So this is a 470, I believe. So we're going to have to solder this on along with these two wires. So let's also tin these. It would help if you have some flux. So ground's on top, power's on the bottom. The cap with the white line right over here, that's negative, the other side's positive. I'll put this wire in here. This is a little tricky. Sorry for bugging you, camera. Alright, I believe that's good. Little bit of a hack job, but it should work. So we're gonna leave that like that for now. Next thing we want to do is get the camera cable. So the camera is going to sit here. The OSD is going to sit on here like so. So we just need a length of wire to go from the back of the camera to the side of the OSD. So I'm thinking around there should be good. It's always better to have extra. And the power wire is going to connect with the video transmitter, giving it 5 volts. So we can cut all these to the same length. Let's move this out of the way. Back to the OSD. Bring all these cables. Alright, now that we tin the wires, we can hook it up. Oh, I need to tin this pad right here. Okay, so ground to ground. Let me just trim this wire a little bit. this back. So we're gonna have to trim this wire. Just gonna pull that away. Short these wires. Press them up, pre-tin them. Ground and video out. Okay, that's all done. So we're gonna fold this inside like so. Fold all these wires inward. We can connect these two wires together. So now that we have it all wired up, I'm going to get the hot glue gun out. I'm going to put a dab of hot glue underneath the cap, squeeze that down, hold it for 30 seconds. We're also going to put a dab at the end of it to hold all these wires into place. Now we get the heat shrink. Feed all the wires through the heat shrink. That. I'll get the hot air gun out. And there we go, the Minimosd is wired up and ready to go. So now what we need to do is connect it. These. Tweezers out. Ground to ground. And power to 5 volts. Done. So this is going to sit in here like so. Okay. So now let's hook up the power wires for the VTX. These. So that hooks up to the main power. Going to ground. There we have it. I'm going to clean up these wires a little bit. Twist them up. Alright, so now we're going to be mounting the OSD. Originally I was going to put it on the bottom plate of the frame, but there's not enough room. So what I'm going to do instead is tape it to the back of the camera. Plug in the telemetry cable. Plug this into the video transmitter. I put a piece of double-sided tape on the back of the camera. So we're going to need the camera plates. Plug the camera in. Stick that onto the back of the camera, like so. Insert the camera plates, line up one side, okay, put in the other side, line it up, we're good to go. Now let's get the top plate installed. So walk it into place. Screw the top plate in. Next, what I'm going to do is get a tie strap. Put a tie strap through these two holes to hold the antenna into place. Now we can bend the antenna into shape, just like that. Now the receiver antennas. I'm going to use tie straps. Put one right there. One on the other side. Oh, I did this wrong. Waste of a zip tie. Feed the antennas up through the frame. One there. One there. Now get some heat shrink. And we want about that much. Cut two pieces equal length. Now we need some electrical tape. Cut a piece of electrical tape. Now just decide your desired angle for your camera and put some screws into the side plates right there, and you're good to go. And that's it. She's all done. Now let's plug her in, get the goggles on, and see if everything's working. Take the lens cap off, of course. And she's working. So the last thing to do is just put a piece of foam on top, feed in your battery straps, and take her out and tune her. That's it. Thanks for watching. Right, we're here outside now. She's all built, props on. We're gonna take her for her first hover and see how she does. So plug her in. Hopefully you guys can see this. And her first hover is complete. So now we can take her to the park and tune it. Looks really, really nice.